Medieval movies love to show endless banquets of roasted pigs, golden goblets, and tables groaning under exotic dishes. The truth was far less glamorous. Food wasn't just about eating, it was about survival, class, and status. What people ate depended on wealth, religion, and what the land could provide. Forget Hollywood feasts, real medieval food was coarse, practical, and sometimes shockingly scarce. Here's the truth about what people in the Middle Ages actually ate. Bread wasn't just food in medieval Europe, it was life itself. For peasants, bread made from rye, barley, or oats was often the main source of calories. This bread was dense, coarse, and sometimes mixed with fillers like peas or acorns when harvests failed. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept people alive. Wealthier households ate lighter, whiter bread made from refined wheat known as manchet, which symbolized status and prosperity. Bread also played a practical role beyond nutrition. Trenchers, thick slices of stale bread served as plates. After absorbing gravy and juices, they were eaten or given to the poor. This practice shows how central bread was not only to eating but to the structure of meals. But dependence on bread came at a cost. A poor harvest meant famine, and whole communities starved when grain supplies ran short. Bread prices dictated survival, and riots broke out during shortages. Eating bread wasn't just daily habit, it was tied directly to life expectancy. Religion influenced bread as well. During Lent or fasting days, richer breads were restricted, forcing people to rely on simpler loaves. Even kings couldn't escape bread's dominance, though theirs was always fresher, finer, and sweeter. Forget banquet tables covered in exotic dishes. For most medieval people, bread wasn't the side dish, it was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was both the fuel of daily life and the difference between plenty and hunger. Hollywood convinces us that medieval people ate meat constantly, tearing into roasted boars like it was everyday life. In reality, meat was rare for most. Peasants might taste pork or chicken a few times a week, but it was often salted, smoked, or pickled since fresh meat spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Wealthier nobles had access to venison, boar, beef, and game birds, but even they didn't eat meat daily. Church restrictions were a huge factor. Nearly half the days in a medieval calendar were fast days, when eating meat was forbidden. This included Lent, Advent, Fridays, and countless saints' days. On those days, fish replaced meat, making it one of the most important proteins of the period. Coastal towns thrived on herring and cod, while inland communities relied on rivers, ponds, and salted fish imports. Game was heavily regulated. Nobles reserved hunting rights for themselves, and poaching could mean death. That meant peasants couldn't easily hunt deer or rabbits without risking severe punishment. They relied instead on pigs, chickens, and occasionally goats, which were practical because they provided more than just meat. Milk, eggs, and fat were equally valuable. Meat was as much a status symbol as it was sustenance. Large roasts at banquets weren't daily meals, but theatrical displays of wealth and privilege. The reality was that medieval diets leaned far more on grains and vegetables than on meat. The image of medieval people gorging on constant feasts is pure Hollywood fantasy. If bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, vegetables were its backbone. Despite stereotypes, medieval people didn't ignore greens. On the contrary, peasants relied heavily on vegetables to survive. Pottage, a thick stew of grains, peas, beans, onions, cabbage, and whatever else was available, was the daily meal for much of the population. It was cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable. Onions, leeks, and cabbage dominated medieval gardens because they were hardy, grew in poor soil, and stored well through the winter. Root crops like carrots and parsnips were staples long before potatoes arrived from the Americas. Beans and peas provided crucial protein for those who couldn't afford meat, making legumes essential to survival. Wealthier households ate more variety, including asparagus, artichokes, and fresh herbs, but vegetables were still looked down on socially. Nobles associated vegetables with peasant food, so they preferred meat-heavy diets at feasts to show off status. Still, vegetables quietly made up the majority of meals for everyone, even in noble households. Cooking methods were basic. Boiling was most common since it required little equipment and stretched ingredients. Pottage could simmer all day, with each family adding what they had to moietir, creating a constantly evolving dish. For peasants, it was often the only hot meal of the day. Vegetables weren't glamorous, but they kept medieval communities alive. They filled bellies, provided vitamins, and balanced the grain-heavy diet. Without pottage and humble garden produce, famine would have struck far more often. Spices in the Middle Ages were less about taste and more about status. Pepper, cinnamon, Cloves, nutmeg, and saffron came from Asia through long trade routes, making them astronomically expensive. Sugar was also a luxury, imported from the Middle East before Europe grew it in colonies centuries later. These weren't everyday ingredients, they were reserved for the wealthy and used as theatrical displays at banquets. For nobles, serving food dusted with exotic spices signaled wealth and power. Dishes were often deliberately overloaded with flavor combinations that seem strange today, like meat cooked with sugar and cloves. Spices also covered up the taste of preserved or less than fresh meat, though their primary purpose was symbolic. They showed a household could afford luxuries most people never even saw. Sugar was sculpted into elaborate figures called subtleties, presented between courses at banquets as edible art. These were not for daily eating, but for spectacle, designed to impress guests with the host's extravagance. For common people, spices were almost non-existent. Occasionally, local herbs like parsley, sage, or mustard seeds flavored food. But imported spices were out of reach. Honey served as the main sweetener, used in mead, baking, and cooking. Spices and sugar transformed meals into political theatre. They weren't about feeding people, they were about projecting dominance. When nobles served saffron-coloured rice or sugar sculptures, it wasn't for taste. It was a message: we are powerful enough to eat the world. Medieval meals weren't just about food, they were about hierarchy. At a noble banquet, everything from seating to serving reinforced status. The king or lord sat at the high table, while lesser nobles and servants sat further away. What you ate, where you sat, and even how you were served reflected your social rank. Table manners developed to mark class boundaries. Nobles were expected to eat with controlled gestures, avoid licking knives, and use trenchers or napkins instead of wiping greasy hands on clothing. Peasants eating communally from pots faced no such rules. Manners weren't about cleanliness, they were about signalling refinement. Banquets doubled as political stages. Feasts marked marriages, alliances, or victories, with food used to showcase wealth and power. Elaborate dishes like peacocks redressed in their feathers, sugar castles, or coloured jellies weren't designed for taste, but for awe. The meal was as much theatre as sustenance, reinforcing the host's dominance over guests. Even portion sizes mattered. Nobles were given the choicest cuts of meat, while lower-ranking guests received simpler fare. Servants and the poor might get leftovers, often distributed after feasts to show generosity. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was a tool of control, reminding everyone of their place in the hierarchy. For peasants, dining meant survival. Families gathered around pottage, bread and ale, eating from shared bowls. It lacked spectacle, but it was practical. In contrast, noble tables turned meals into statements of authority. Eating in the Middle Ages was never just about hunger, it was about power. Medieval food wasn't the endless parade of roasted meats and goblets shown in movies. It was bread as the daily lifeline, vegetables simmered into pottage, meat reserved for rare occasions, and spices used as displays of wealth. Meals revealed status as much as they filled stomachs. For most, survival depended on humble staples, not lavish feasts. If you want to know how people really lived, look at their tables and then watch our next video.